We are now being recorded. So welcome everybody. Thank you for attending the Equine Science Center's first fall, / almost winter webinar. We hope to have a second one. I do want to mention I don't have a date yet. Hopefully it'll either be next Tuesday or the following Tuesday. I'm still working out with our speaker. I'm hoping to have Dr. Frank Andrews on. He will be talking to us about some of the research he's done with gastric ulcers and some of the supplements and things that could help prevent or decrease the severity of that. So I will post more or let everybody know as we get closer with that. But let me just introduce myself for those of you who are new. I'm Dr. Carrie Williams. I'm the Equine Extension Specialist here at Rutgers University, and I'm also the Associate Director of Extension for the Equine Science Center. I've run a few webinar series for the Equine Science Center of the last few years, usually in the spring and in the fall. We took a little bit of a hiatus. This is actually a new format. The Adobe Connect platform is a little bit new, so now that that's up and running, we're doing our first Adobe Connect webinar now. So my topic will be human diet fads and how they've affected horse nutrition. And I was asked to give this talk at the Minnesota Nutrition Conference back in September. And it was a new talk for me, and it went over so well up there that I gave a little snippet of the talk for the Equine Science Center's Evening of Science and Celebration. And I figured I would give the extended version here as a webinar. So I also want to mention, as we go through the talk, if anybody has any burning questions about one of the slides that I'm on or a certain topic that I'm on, please go ahead in that chat box that was in the lower right-hand corner and type your question. I have Jennifer Weinert. She's actually my new graduate student, my new PhD student here at Rutgers University. She's helping me man the questions today. And if it's appropriate for me to be interrupted, she's going to jump on with her microphone and tell me that there's a question that came in that I should answer. Otherwise, if there's just a general question that's not related to the slides, you can go ahead and hold your questions till the end. I should have about 5 or 10 minutes of time at the end to answer anybody's questions that you might have. And like I mentioned, we're also recording the webinar, so they will be archived and posted on the Equine Science Center website, and we'll send a press release around when that will be available as well. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start. So just as a little brief introduction, the way I pulled together this talk was by using a lot of things that I've learned over the last few years in being an extension specialist. I've been here at Rutgers about 13 years and have come in contact with a lot of different people. They've asked a lot of different questions. So some of these are just from the horse-owning public. I also have good relationships with a lot of feed and supplement companies, and through a lot of talking with them, and did a little bit of surveying them over the past few months. And some of these topics are either also what the public had wanted, but there are also some that came from the feed companies, ones that they've heard. So I know a lot of horse owners like to use their own knowledge of their own diets in order to feed their horses. So we're going to start off. I think I have 6 different diet fads that we're going to go through. Some of them might have some myths associated with them, and we're going to clarify some things. So the first one we're going to talk about is low-carb diets for horses. And I think when I first got here at Rutgers, one of the first questions I was asked is how someone can make a no-starch diet or a no-carb diet for their horse. Hopefully everybody out there is, at least realizes a little bit that there's really no such thing as a no-carb diet. Fortunately, recently the questions have turned into more of a low-carb diet, which is a little better. But again, there's really no such thing as no starch, because really forages are fiber. Fiber is a carbohydrate. And if they're on any sort of grain at all, grains are majority starch. So there's going to be a lot of starch in their diet as well, depending on how much grain or the types of grains they're feeding. Now, some products recently with some of these feed companies have been formulated to be a restricted starch or restricted sugar diet, and that just means that they've included no molasses or corn, and they replaced a lot of the grains with another high fiber ingredient. And we're going to talk a little bit about those as we go through. Now, I just want to clarify and get everybody on the same page for dietary carbohydrates and just clarify some of the terminology you might hear. So whenever I say starch, really all that is an enzymatic cleave of the starch gives you many, many glucose molecules. So it's just a very large string of glucoses. The glucoses are attached very easily and they can be broken down very easily. Then we also have what's called ESC. You'll see ESC, and no, I don't mean Equine Science Center, but it's ethanol soluble carbohydrates. CHO is my abbreviation for carbohydrates. And what that is most of the simple sugars, things like glucose, fructose, sucrose, all of these simple sugars. You add an ethanol extraction to them, and they basically just fall apart. So some of the forage analyses you'll see will have ESC. Then there's also fructans. Some of you might have heard fructans associated with grasses and forages. These are a chain of fructose molecules instead of glucose molecules. And then we have water-soluble carbohydrates, or WSC. Now, WSC is just combining the simple sugars of ESC with the fructans. And then last but not least are NSC, or non-structural carbohydrates, which will probably sound even more familiar to everybody. And that's basically just an addition of all of them. So you're adding starch, ESC, and your fructans, or your WSC. So you're just adding them all together. So now low starch diets are appropriate for some horses, and they might even be necessary for some horses. For example, some of these metabolically challenged horses, or the horses with equine metabolic syndrome, some will have insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia, Cushing's disease, chronic laminitis, colic, etc., etc. So some of these horses will have abnormally high blood glucose or insulin measured in their system. Now, if you're working with your vet on this, that's great, but they should really be doing another definitive test other than just a blood glucose or insulin sample. They should have either an oral glucose tolerance test done, a dexamethasone suppression test, ACTH measurements, etc. Something else should be done before taking drastic measures to change their diet or put them on drugs. There is drugs available, so it's not the end of the world, but definitely work with your vet to get all this figured out first. Now, with these horses, they do require dietary starch and sugar at a restricted level. And usually the only way this is needed, or the only thing that's needed to do here, is just to feed them a high forage diet with about 2 to 2.5% of the body weight in forage. So really sometimes they don't even need any grain in their diet if they're obese or even have a decent body weight. So they shouldn't need any grains at all. However, some animals, in order to maintain their body weight, might need an additional supplement of a grain or something else. And in this case, they really need to have that restricted starch or sugar, so a low NSC diet or something formulated with higher fiber, things like that. You can also add some fat supplements. We're going to talk a little bit more about fat supplements in a few slides, so I'm not going to get too much into it now. But just know that fat supplements will not affect the insulin sensitivity of the horses, so that's actually a good way to add some extra calories to their diet. Horses that are affected by tying up, it's also called exertional rhabdomyolysis. These horses also require low sugar and low starch, but they are different from our metabolically prone horses because these are typically really intensely exercising horses. Just for example, some of the pictures below, eventers, endurance horses, race horses. They really need special diets that are formulated with really high fat levels in order to maintain their really high energy levels. They also can have some rapidly fermentable carbohydrates, and what these are, things like beet pulp, is rapidly fermentable because it's not digested and absorbed in the small intestine by enzymes, but instead rolls over to the large intestine and is fermented by microbes in the hindgut. So these are actually really good energy sources as well. And they don't have the same effect that starches and sugars do by being absorbed in the small intestine. Yep.
Yeah, this is Jen. Caitlin Mori has a question for you, going back to the forage requirements and and I didn't know if you wanted me to just answer that or if you wanted to go ahead and answer her.
Oh, I can address that. Yeah, I can definitely clarify that. Thank you for interrupting me on that one. Because, yeah, when I mentioned 2 to 2.5% of the body weight, let's go back up to where I said that, and that is per day. That is kind of a basic guideline for feeding horses, is that all horses need to consume 2 to 2.5% of their body weight, and now that's in dry matter. So if they're out on pasture, that's going to be, you know, there's a lot of water in pasture. So in dry matter, they're going to be eating a lot more than just, say, 20 to 25 pounds if you have a 1,000-pound animal. But if you're feeding hay, they're probably going to be, you know, hay is only about 8 to 10% water, so they're probably going to be eating right about 20 to 25 pounds of hay per day. And that's kind of a good level to start at. If you're weighing your feed out for your horses, start weighing your hay to see how much they're eating. And then any grain that they're getting on top of that could also be weighed and added to that 2 to 2.5% of the body weight. So that's a great question. Thank you for stopping me and letting me clarify that. So let's talk about other horses that actually, not necessarily all horses should have a low starch diet. There are actually some that should require higher levels of soluble carbohydrates, like these intensely exercising horses. Now, these are different from the tying up horses because they don't have any metabolic issues. But the majority of their calories needs to come from carbohydrates because starch is really the only good way to replenish their muscle glycogen. So if they're training multiple days in a row, or if they're in a competition multiple days in a row, or if they're in you know, heavy training like a racehorse is, or heavy competition, a 3-day eventer, etc., they really need the starch to replenish their muscle glycogen quickly, because horses don't do so like humans do. They need really high carbohydrate levels. Also, without a gallbladder, sometimes it's really hard for horses to consume enough fat in order to sustain their energy levels at the really high level or peak of intense training. And again, we'll talk about fat in just a little bit, but 20% fat in the diet is all they can maintain, which isn't bad for that 2 to 2.5% body weight in forage, because forage only has about 3% fat. But it gets to be a problem when you're adding on a lot of corn oil or a lot of fat supplements. So what about horses that don't have metabolic syndrome or don't have another condition? They just happen to get really fruity on a high NSC diet, or they get hot. I hear that term a lot. Some of these horses are really sensitive to it. They kind of act like this guy here, act a little fruity when they get a little bit too much sugar or starch, bucking, kicking, spooking. They're just generally excitable. In this case, corn is definitely one of these feeds that should not be fed. Corn actually has the highest level of starch out of any of the grains and is really rapidly broken down. So if you think of a kid that just ate its whole entire bag of Halloween candy, what's going to happen? It's going to run around the house and, you know, tear things apart. Well, what's going to happen in another hour or two is going to crash. And the same thing happens to our horses when they're on a high sugar or starch diet in some cases. So here you do want to look for a more restricted starch diet, something with more of the rapidly fermentable fibers, or something that just doesn't have a lot of corn or a lot of molasses in them. So I'm going to move on a little bit to a different diet fad that I think is, I kind of made it very general. So diet fad 2 is this magic pill, magic supplement. We want a pill that is going to cure everything. And horse owners want the same. They want a magic supplement. They want it to help horses with every problem under the sun. Granted, I'm generalizing. But if your horse is receiving a very well-balanced diet, horses shouldn't necessarily need an extra supplement. However, there are a couple cases when a supplement might be necessary, and that's what my next few slides are going to go through, is times or in cases where a supplement should be needed or might be needed. So let's go back to those horses with exertional rhabdomyolysis, or those horses that tie up. So when these horses tie up, they have problems within their muscles. So not only should they have low levels of sugars and starches, but vitamin E supplement has actually been shown to help them with their muscle metabolism. You can feed this vitamin, which is actually found in very low levels in most grass hay. It's a little bit higher in pasture grass. But if your horse is working heavily and does have exertional rhabdomyolysis, you can feed between 2,500 and 5,000 IU of vitamin E per day. And what this is going to do is going to help with the integrity of the muscle membranes, and is going to prevent any leakage of enzymes out of the enzymes, or out of the muscle membrane. So in this case, though, you really want to read the label of the supplement to find out how many IUs are in a scoop or an ounce, because some of them are only formulated to have 500 or 1,000 per scoop or per ounce, and you don't want to be giving a whole bucket of this powdered supplement. Some of them, though, are formulated to be more concentrated, so 1 ounce might have 5,000 IU. You also want to make sure that the vitamin E supplement doesn't have a lot of other things in it. You can just get a pure vitamin E supplement if that's all you want. A lot of them are combined with selenium, but when you have to go up to 5,000 IU, you don't want to be overdosing your selenium. And I also get the question a lot, what is better, synthetic or natural? Or many people think that only the natural form is absorbed. That's actually not the case. I've done vitamin E research for about 15 years now, and pretty much everything I've used has been the synthetic DL-alpha tocopherol acetate form, and we found really good results with both helping with the muscle membranes and with its absorption. Granted, the natural vitamin E is absorbed at a little bit greater rate, but you don't need to feed as much, and it's also very expensive. So you kind of have to figure out what best suits your situation. And your situation can be, you know, in terms of monetary, if it's a financial situation or not. So it really kind of depends on what you want. So what about electrolytes? Oh, do we have another question?
Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, there's a question from Melanie. Yeah, there's a question from Melanie regarding the percent NSC.
Right, the percent of NSC that's good for the average horse. Great question. Sorry I blew over that, but yeah, pretty much anything less than 10% is actually considered low. So if you have a feed or a diet or even a supplement that's less than 10% non-structural carbohydrates or NSC, that's low, so that would be great for the equine metabolic syndrome horse. Something less than 15%, probably, or around 15% is okay for an average horse. You know, some can even get up to 20%, and if the horse doesn't have any metabolic problems, they're probably just fine. Things that get over, you know, 20%, a lot of people like to kind of steer away from, but they're great for the exercising horse. You know, I've seen things up to 23, 24, 25%, and those are usually the more intensely exercising horse feeds, high energy feeds. Good question. I hope that helped. So let's move on to electrolytes. Now, electrolytes are a must-have in certain situations. There are things like sodium chloride, magnesium, calcium chloride. There are these minerals with a charge to them. They are only needed, however, when the horse is sweating. So daily supplementation of these electrolytes actually might throw off the natural balance of these in the system. So you don't want to just be feeding an everyday electrolyte supplement unless the horse is really seriously sweating every day. So horses like this one here, you can really see the lather, the white latherin in the sweat come out. You know, if you're doing this every day, then yeah, electrolytes might be necessary. It's just good to point out, though, that all electrolytes are not created equal. So you really need to look at the label. If you look at the label with these electrolytes, they should have sodium chloride or salt as the #1 ingredient. Because if, like Gatorade, which is great for our electrolyte replenishment, what does Gatorade have as one of the #1 ingredients? It's going to have a sugar, glucose, fructose, something like that. And that just means that it is too diluted. It's kind of like taking Kool-Aid and watering it down. You're actually diluting out the electrolytes, and they're not getting enough in their system. I just happened to glance over and see that Maggie asked about what about horses on Lasix. In regards to their electrolyte supplementation, it's going to be even more important because meanwhile, the Lasix is a diuretic. They're urinating all of their fluids out. So now they have a low fluid level in their system, but they also are sweating, so they have a low electrolyte level in their horses. So they're really going to have to worry about, after the race or when they're all done, replenish the fluids along with the electrolytes. Good questions. So another supplement, like joint supplements. I'm not saying joint supplements are necessary, but they could be helpful in the horse that is suffering from some sort of a joint problem, whether it be osteoarthritis or, just, something in their joints, arthritic related that they might benefit from. However, not all horses respond the same way. Some horses are actually considered non-responders. So you might actually have two horses that have the exact same condition. You feed the exact same supplement at the exact same levels, and one will respond. You'll notice it start to look a lot less stiff in the morning. It warms up quicker. It deals with cold weather better, etc. With the other horse acts the same. And that's just because some of these ingredients like glucosamine, chondroitin sulfate, MSM, hyaluronic acid, they don't necessarily act the same way in all these horses. And people are actually the same way too. Some people are non-responders to some of these supplements. A lot of supplements also include this ASU, which is avocado unsaponifiables. I can never say that word. Vitamin C, magnesium, yucca, etc. The list goes on. So there's not a whole lot of research done showing that any of these products are preventative, but they could potentially help with a horse that has an existing condition. Just again, read the labels, look at ingredients levels, because a lot of them have such low levels in them, they're not going to be effective, so you really get what you pay for. The higher levels of some of these active ingredients have actually shown to be better. In terms of, and you get what you pay for in terms of the price. So some of the quality control of these supplements is pretty poor as well, and the supplement is going to be a lot cheaper. So just be an educated buyer and really read the labels before you purchase a supplement. Kind of the same holds true actually for hoof supplements. I'm just mentioning that because hoof supplements can be a possibility with horses with poor or crumbly hooves. Biotin is shown at about 20 milligrams per day that it does activate the production of keratin, and there's a lot of keratin in hooves. Some of these hoof supplements also contain iodine, and research has shown that it's essential for thyroid hormones that helps develop all sorts of tissues in our body, and that's actually needed at 1 milligram per day. Methionine is good to have in the supplement, in this combo supplement as well. The levels aren't really as well known, but it is responsible for the keratin production again in the hoof. And zinc is also another mineral. It should be in any supplement at about 175 to 200 milligrams per day. And this helps contribute to just the overall hoof health, and it helps control its metabolism. Now, I do want to mention, if poor hooves are caused by an environmental factor, there's no hoof supplement that's actually going to cure something that's caused by a poor environment. So you need to look at the environment as well. And these supplements aren't going to be effective in the short term, because think about how hooves grow. They grow from this level at the coronary band down to the ground in about 6 to 8, even up to a year for the horses that have really slow growing hooves. So you really should have these horses, if you do want to see if the hoof supplements are making a difference, on this supplement for about a year. And again, read the labels. Just make sure that these levels of these ingredients are actually in the supplement. So a lot of other supplements, and I have a whole talk that could go on for about an hour and a half on supplements. They really have no scientific research on a lot of them to back their efficacy. So if you do decide to try them for a few months. If they're not working, or if you don't think they're working, don't waste your money. A lot of these are not intended to have overnight effects. You know, things like calming aids, digestive products, immune stimulators, co-conditioners, muscle builders, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on forever. And I just pulled a couple pictures off the internet here, some different supplements, not really promoting or degrading any supplement here. Just know that, you know, they might not work for all horses. So you really need to be educated buyer, check the supplement ingredients labels. My email's at the end. You can always email me if you have any questions as well. So speaking of supplements, I'm going to talk about one more, but that's actually my diet fad number 3. Deals with omega-3 fatty acids, because there's a lot of questions in horse nutrition as to what is really the proper ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s. And will excessive omega-6 fatty acids in your horse be detrimental? I know in humans that's a really big thing to have really high omega-3s. Lots of fish in the diet, and lately now they're saying coconut and coconut oil is the best thing for humans and in their diets because they have high omega-3s. Well, I'm going to explain why this might not be as big of an issue with horse nutrition as it is for human nutrition. So with horses, there really are no bad oils or bad fatty acids for horses. And the reason for this is because that all horses require a dietary source of both a linoleic and an alpha-linolenic acid. So the omega-6 and the omega-3s are required. And that's because horses actually lack the enzymes necessary to synthesize some of their own fatty acids. So they need a dietary source. So regardless of what oil or what fat product you're using, if it's used properly and it's oxidized for energy and incorporated into the cells, it will do so just fine. Now let me clarify why some oils might be better than others. So as we all know, probably as you're out there listening, that corn oil or some other vegetable oils are really high in omega-6s, or much higher in omega-6s than omega-3s. And we know, some of us know anyway, from human nutrition that they can contribute to increased inflammation and reduced cellular immunity. And again, a lot of this is from human research and in human knowledge. And we know that eating fish has a lot of health benefits because of the high omega-3s, but this is also true for things like flaxseed or linseed, which is actually more typical that we feed to our horses. What I bet you don't know, however, is that pasture grasses, good quality, good old cool season pasture grasses, have similar omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids as flaxseed. So if you're feeding your daily dose of say 2 to 3 cups of flaxseed, there is as much omega-3 fatty acids in that level of flaxseed as there is in 22 pounds of grass hay. So there is your 2 to 2.5% of forage diet. So if this is the case, do I have a question? Should I stop? Nope.
Yeah, yes,
Nope.
but I was going to let you finish your thought on omega-3s. I was trying to catch you before you went on.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Tom had a question about electrolytes and salt blocks versus mineral blocks as electrolyte sources.
You know, they will have their sodium chloride when the horse wants them, and that's the problem, because I've seen some salt blocks lay out in a field never touched ever. So if your horse really, really needs electrolytes and it's really sweating, I wouldn't leave it up to them and to their choice that they would replenish them, because not all electrolytes will the horses actually balance themselves. They will crave salt and they will lick salt on occasion, but the salt blocks alone are not concentrated enough with the other, the magnesium, the calcium, the potassium, etc. And mineral blocks as well. They just do not have the concentration. They're just very, very, very small trace levels of the other minerals. So they should not be used, they should be given to all horses, but they should not be used as an electrolyte supplement. And I might as well start, I'll move on. I also see another question that aren't fats lost in grass as they're dried into hay? No, they're not actually. The only things that are lost in hay once things are dried and left in the sun are your vitamins. Vitamins are lost almost completely. If they're soaked or if it's rained on, you're going to lose a lot of the sugars and some potassium as well. And there might be a very small protein or a very small fat loss, but even the levels of hay do still have high levels of your omega-3 fatty acids. So these horses with a forage-only diet of just this grass, hay, or pasture are going to have an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of 0.3 to 0.6 to 1. If you're adding a high-fat commercial concentrate, your level is probably going to go up to 8 to 1. Now, what we typically recommend for humans is a less than 10 to 1 ratio. So even with a high-fat supplement on a forage-based diet, you're at 8 to 1. You're less than the human recommended levels. Now, the only trick here is there are no recommendations for horses. No one has said that there is a specific level of omega-6s to omega-3s that horses need. And the reason for this is because there's so much conflicting research out there. Do all omega-3s really reduce inflammation in all horses? Do feeding different oils have different effects on insulin-resistant horses? What about the enhanced cellular immunity and the chronic inflammation stage type diseases like arthritis, HEAVs, obesity? There's so much conflicting research out there that there's really not enough definitive explanation as to why or what level the horses need. So what would be my recommendation? If you have a horse on a poor quality forage diet, either old hay or really stemmy hay, very mature hay, and it needs more energy to maintain its weight, so therefore it needs a fat supplement, you might want to consider adding a high quality fat supplement. Something like flaxseed, which has a 0.26 to 1, or fish oil, which is the best at a 0.13 to 1. However, if your horses are allowed a little bit of pasture or have a good quality forage, they already have a really low ratio, and therefore spending a lot of money on a really expensive supplement might not be worth it. You can probably get away with rice bran, which is 19 to 1, or soybean oil, which is 7 to 1, or even corn oil, which is 53 to 1. But if they have such a low level anyway, it just might not matter. So it really depends on your situation. So I'm going to go through my diet fad number 4 pretty quickly because again, I could have a whole nother talk dealing with holistic remedies or natural remedies for horses. Before I go through these, I will say that there is a paper that I wrote in 2008. It's actually a really good summary of a lot of herbal products and a lot of the research that was done in horses on herbal supplements. Is there a question before I move on?
Yeah, Dr. Malinowski asked a question about fish oil, and Ashley Bayer also has a question.
Okay, thank you. Fish oil is palatable to horses. Oh, that's a good question. I should have addressed that. When we first started, in terms of supplement companies, when they first started feeding fish oils to horses, it smelled and it tasted like fish. And no, the horses hated it. However, because it's been, 10 years or so that a lot of these have been on the market, they've actually extracted or removed any of the odor and any of the taste of the fish. And I can confirm this because I actually tasted one of the fish oils just to make sure, and they are completely odorless and completely tasteless. So they will just be like any other oil. If your horse doesn't like the consistency of oil, they probably won't like it, but it really doesn't have a smell or an odor at all. Are there any oils that horses do prefer? There was actually some studies done, and they were done at Virginia Tech many years ago, but they looked at soybean oil versus corn oil versus, I want to say the other one was like a canola oil or something, and just out of those 3 oils, the horses actually preferred corn oil over any of the other oils. So they really preferred corn oil. You know, granted now there's so many different oils on the market. You know, I think a study probably does need to be done again to see, do they prefer olive oil over flaxseed oil over rice bran oil, because there's so many of them out there now. Even the coconut oil, I think, is starting to be really popular as well. But those are good questions. Thank you. So let's get back to the holistic remedies. I'm just going to talk about concerns if you are going with any herbal product or anything along those lines. Just keep in mind that just because they're natural doesn't necessarily mean they're safe, because a lot of these herbal products are actually used from plants or plant parts that are toxic to horses. Horsetail is a great example. I see this an awful lot on the market, marketed for horses, but it's toxic at certain levels. It can cause weight loss, diarrhea, even some nervous system conditions like lack of coordination. So you really have to be careful about what you're feeding and be educated in terms of what's good and what's not. There are also some that have a negative interaction with other dietary products or medications. So you really should consult with your veterinarian or a nutritionist in this case to find out. One example would be Warfarin or any blood thinners. A lot of herbal products actually exacerbate that and cause a lot of bleeding issues. There are some substances that are actually on the banned substance list on some show or racing circuits. One good example is valerian or valerian root. It has the same sedative properties as some low-grade phenobarbital. So it could be, it's used in a lot of calming aids or a lot of calming products. So you really want to check the banned substance list and check your product to make sure that it will not test if you are a competitive person. And fourth and finally, there is very little research on herbal products in horses. A lot has been done on humans or laboratory animals. And a lot of the research that has been done, there's been, you know, things on echinacea, garlic, polyherbal products, etc. A lot of that research has shown that horses do not react the same way in their diets and their effects of some of these products that humans and horses and the humans and other lab animals do. So again, be an educated buyer and kind of do your research before adding these into your horse's diets. Continuing on with kind of the same natural theme, but now we're talking about natural diets. I think lately especially kind of this homemade muesli mix or this unprocessed whole grain diets or whole grain feeds for horses seems to be all the rage. And I do know there is some benefits. I agree they can be much easier to use if you're trying to figure out where a horse might be allergic to a certain ingredient. You can remove, if you're feeding, you know, oats, barley, and corn, you can remove one at a time and go from there. Or, you know, you can just add in one thing at a time to see what they're allergic to. If you're feeding a lot of horses and you're making a bulk feed, it may be more economical than buying the bag feed, but you really need to be feeding a lot of horses and going through bulk quickly because a lot of times it goes bad. And there are also many other complex considerations to go through when balancing a ration. There's so many different ratios of the minerals and vitamins and things like that that, you know, it really should be careful consideration should be taken when developing any of these diets. Now, there are also a lot of ingredients that are processed in a certain way to increase their digestibility, and I'm going to talk about a few of those as we go through the next couple slides. But first I want to mention, and here's my 2 to 2.5% body weight again, a lot of horses don't necessarily need anything other than forage or pasture to maintain their body weight, especially if they're not exercising, pregnant, or growing. They've got their own natural diet right there with the pasture grass or the forage, so feed them that. However, if the horse is exercising or a hard keeper, etc., you might need to add some extra calories. So in this case, if you do want a truly unprocessed whole grain, oats is going to be your best bet. So oats are actually the most common grain fed to horses. Processing it in any way does not increase digestibility. I know a lot of people think when you see the hulls of the oats come out in the manure that they're not digesting it. But that's actually just the hull. That's the plant components, the very structural, cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin component that is digested but very lightly in the horse. The good part, the inside of the grain, is actually processed just fine. Now, oats are also very high in fiber, higher in fiber than most grains, and actually lower in sugars and starches than most grains. Even though they do have oat starch is very digestible, the level in general is much lower. Another grain, if anybody's interested in feeding whole grains, is barley. Now, barley is also a good grain. It is a little higher in starch and a little lower in fiber than oats, but it does require processing. You should never feed whole barley because the shell is way too hard and the horses won't be able to process it or digest it correctly without some sort of rolling, crimping, cracking, something like that. Now, if the forage that you're feeding happens to be low in protein, you might want to consider adding a high protein supplement. The best all-natural protein supplement for horses is alfalfa. Alfalfa has very high levels of protein, around 20 to 25%. Give or take, and it also has high levels of calcium. So if added to another forage mix, or if cubes might just be added onto the diet, it's actually a really good way to add protein. If alfalfa isn't an option, you can go with soybean meal, which is also very high in protein. However, I do say soybean meal. The meal actually needs to be removed and the soybeans must be processed. Horses actually shouldn't have whole soybeans. There's actually a trypsin inhibitor in these whole soybeans that negates the level of protein or the high level of protein in them. They should also be soaked overnight if they're going to be cooked. So some of the processing could be cooking, but they should be soaked as well. Now, whole soybeans do contain a very high, fairly high level of fat, so they're decent to feed, but they really need to be processed before. Here are some of the fat supplements I just want to mention a little bit as well. High-fat ingredients obviously need processing. They need to have the oil extracted from them, or they need to have the bran, which is the layer just under the hull of the grain, to be removed. Rice bran is the most common or the most popular bran. It's very palatable, very high in fiber, and it's also fairly high in fat. It has about 26% fat in it. So it can increase the calorie content of the diet without giving that hot horse appeal or that high non-structural carbohydrate component of the diet. A 1,000-pound horse can get about 1 to 2 pounds per day. And that's, I usually like to do that, especially some of these unthrifty horses or these older horses in the winter. They might lose a little bit of body condition, so you can add on about 1 to 2 pounds, add it in slowly, and that just helps them give a little bit of extra calories in the winter. Now, natural rice bran is actually low in calcium and really high in phosphorus, which disrupts the calcium to phosphorus ratio. So all rice bran should be stabilized, and it will say right on the bag that it's stabilized, which means it's fortified with calcium. So that'll put the calcium to phosphorus ratio back into play. However, if you are feeding a large alfalfa ration, then it also has high calcium, so you should be okay. But just keep that in mind. I do want to address, and it's not on the slide, wheat bran. Wheat bran is actually the same, or very similar. It's also very high in phosphorus and low in calcium. So if you are using it for a bran mash in the winter, I wouldn't add it at very high levels. It should be very low levels, and it shouldn't be fed every day because it will disrupt that calcium to phosphorus ratio. Flax seeds, we'll address those again. They are a good fat source. However, raw seeds do contain a cyanogenic glycoside component. So that means when these seeds are fed ground or moistened, it releases cyanide. That doesn't sound good, does it? Well, the good news is that enzymes or gastric acids within the animal's stomach actually will help release will inactivate these enzymes, and they will stop the release of the cyanide. So you can feed raw flax seeds. They have just as much fat in them, and they will degrade and they will be digested. However, don't feed the flax seeds whole unless you're boiling it. They should not be moistened, or they shouldn't be put in water prior to feeding. They need to be boiled, or they need to be not soaked at all. Same thing goes for raw nuts. Right around this time of year, I get a lot of questions about people who are making horse treats to give as gifts or presents, and some people like to use raw nuts. It's very similar to soybeans. They shouldn't be fed in large quantities, and they shouldn't be fed raw because they do also produce a toxin. So, you know, if they're cooked in some way, that definitely helps, but not raw and not in large amounts. I think this is my last natural ingredient, things like garlic. I know a lot of people like to feed garlic because it acts as an insect repellent or an anti-inflammatory. However, there has been some studies done using garlic that has shown that in very high doses, it actually causes Heinz body anemia. So what that means is it deforms the red blood cells so that it decreases the oxygen carrying capacity of the cells. So horses will actually start to suffocate if it gets really bad. Or have a lot of breathing trouble. So horses shouldn't be fed more than about 10 grams per day, which actually sounds quite high, but this is not in extract form. This would just be, you know, ground or dried garlic. However, I will say there's little known about the long-term effects and the effectiveness in horses. So here's a little bit more on salt, and I just threw this in here because I know there's a lot of really fancy salts on the market. Here's the one that's a Himalayan salt block, you know, that can go on forever. There's a whole bunch of different types of salt. And really there's not a whole lot of research on these to show that any of these fancy salt blocks are really any different in terms of their sodium chloride content or doing anything special than just a plain old white salt block. And as I mentioned earlier, I just recommend the white salt blocks because, you know, I've seen horses consume, you know, 50-pound blocks in 3 days. I wouldn't want to add in any other minerals that might have a chance of being toxic. White salt is more the way to go. So I guess just within this diet fad, the take-home message here is that balancing rations is a very complicated process. There are a lot of vitamins and minerals that need to be in right proportions. So this is why a good nutritionist is needed for balancing any of these whole grain diets. And that's why a lot of us just pay for very well-researched formulations with a lot of these commercial feeds or these bagged feeds. So I'm going to end with my number 6 diet fad, or my last diet fad, and just talk about GMO products in animals, or genetically modified organisms, or products that have been genetically modified. Now, corn and soybeans do make up a very large portion of horse feeds, these bagged horse feeds. And both of these have been genetically modified organisms, or GMO products, since 1997. Now, more recently, in just 2011, they've approved the use of alfalfa as a GMO product as well. Now let me just take a step back and make sure that we're all on the same page with what a GMO product is. GMO has had the DNA altered in some way to help the plant resist things like insects, herbicides, viruses, things like that, just to name a few. Now farmers use these plant products to have higher profits, higher plant yields, healthier plants, etc. So let's take alfalfa for example. Alfalfa has been able to be grown without the introduction of weeds since 2011. And that is because if they didn't have the genetic modification of the weeds, or to resist some of these weeds, things like fiddleneck can actually cause toxic liver failure and possible death in horses. Now, without the use of this GMO modification, the hay farmer is going to need to use a lot of chemical herbicides to kill the weeds in the alfalfa fields. So this has actually made a more healthy alfalfa and a more healthy product for the horses. Now, I know the public is concerned a lot about feeding livestock animals GMO products because of their carryover in dairy products or meat products, beef, poultry, etc. But with horses, it's more of a concern like it is for ourselves. We're just concerned that it's just a health issue when we consume these GMO products. Now the question does become, is this concern really validated? There is a lot of research that's been done, but a lot of it's failed to prove that there are really specific dangers that come from consumption of these grains, these GMO grains, by horses, livestock, or even humans for that matter. I am not going to argue any of these for or against. I'm just going to throw up some facts here. It is virtually impossible to completely guarantee that a crop or a field is totally non-GMO. So think about how plants grow. They grow with the use of pollen and the spreading of pollen from bees or insects or wind to help pollinate fields. Pollen travels fairly great distance, so it's almost impossible to guarantee that nearby GMO crops have not spread to non-GMO fields. So a lot of horse feed companies have started producing, or at least looking into the possibility of producing non-GMO feeds because the public has asked for them. They've had a lot of issues during a lot of this time as well, and a lot of it relates to cost. The cost of a non-GMO corn, soybean, or alfalfa product is much higher, and sometimes it's actually cost prohibitive because the bags of feed become way too great in cost. So it also becomes hard to guarantee that their product is totally organic. Because if it's non-GMO, it's probably not organic. A lot of the GMO feeds actually have no significant safety differences or differences in digestibility or nutritional value. There's been studies that have shown no residues of some of this recombinant DNA or these novel proteins in the animals that are eating the GMO products. So in the animals, whether it's horses, cows, beef, pigs, etc. So what are my take-home messages here? So my first fad dealt with low carbohydrate diets, and it's okay if it's a restricted starch or a low carb diet, but there is no such thing as a no carb diet. There are also no magic pills or supplements that will cure or correct all problems. So some supplements are necessary some supplements are necessary, but most aren't if they have a well-balanced diet. Forage is a really high supply of omega-3 fatty acids, and horses on a good quality pasture or really good quality hay already have a decent ratio. Holistic supplements need to be used with caution because there's really very little equine research done. Whole grain diets or unprocessed feeds are okay, but they might require the advice of a nutritionist to balance some of these diets as well. And in the human nutrition area, there are a lot of concerns about eating GMO type products. Is it really a concern for horses? I think a little more research needs to be done there, but right now there's been no research that has shown any ill effects on some other animals. So I'm just going to wrap up there and say that you guys can start if you have more questions for me. You can go ahead and type them into the box. I'll go ahead and answer them as well. If you don't get a chance to ask them today, you can go on to your email and go ahead and email me. I'm more than happy to take your questions. Just tell me that you listened to the webinar and you had some questions from the webinar. Definitely stay tuned. Look at the Equine Science Center, the esc.rutgers.edu website. That's our wonderful Equine Science Center website. I'm going to advertise our next webinar in the fall webinar series. We also have a Facebook page, so if you haven't liked the Equine Science Center on Facebook, please do. We're also advertising these webinars and a lot of our other events on our Facebook page as well. So with that, I'll go ahead. It looks like I've got a question coming in from Caitlin. She's got a 19-year-old warm blood that is prone to stomach ulcers due to stress, and what grain is best? Good question, and I really wish I had a date for our next webinar because Dr. Frank Andrews is going to come talk all about supplements and feeding horses with gastric ulcers. But I will say there's no good grain that will be good for horses with gastric ulcers because grain is a big trigger for a lot of the pain that comes with gastric ulcers because they produce so much gastric acid, and grain will actually trigger more gastric acid release. So really alfalfa. Any alfalfa-based product is the best stomach acid buffer because of its high levels of calcium. A lot of the supplements out there for gastric ulcers do have high levels of calcium, but just good old alfalfa really works. You can get alfalfa cubes. I know sometimes when my horse goes to a show, she goes off of her grain. She won't eat any grain. But if I give her a bucket full of alfalfa cubes, she scarfs them down. So it really is a good way. But definitely stay tuned to our next webinar because he'll have a lot more information on that. I'm glad to know, Monica, that this is a lot of the fads that you've heard as well, so thank you, and thank you all. So Ashley asked if horsetail can be toxic to horses. Why do they sell it? Good question. There are a lot of other things other than just the horsetail that I've seen. The other ones aren't off the top of my head right now because I haven't given that talk in a while. You know, they sell them, they claim that, you know, that they're fed at lower levels so that they are beneficial if they're fed at lower levels. Again, I think it's all a good marketing scam, and they're hoping that people don't know that the products are toxic. And they might have some efficacy in humans, or they might have some efficacy in rats, but they, you know, and they market it as such, but they don't really take into account that horses are different. So, unfortunately. Well, thank you all for the comments. I'm glad everybody liked the talk. I will stay on for a little bit longer yet, but as people are logging off, I do want to mention we did record the webinar today. It will get posted after both webinars are over, probably close to the holiday. It will get posted on the Equine Science Center website, so if you have any friends who might have missed it, they can go ahead and log on and listen as well. And yes, I'm trying to get that date out, and I will let everybody know when the next webinar is as well. Well, thank you. I hope everybody had a good lunchtime. This lunchtime webinar seemed to be fairly popular, or more popular than our evening webinars have been. So we'll definitely have the next webinar will be at noon. I'm hoping either next Tuesday or the following Tuesday after that. So again, thank you guys so much. And if you don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and wish all of you guys a happy rest of your week.